Hi everybody, this is David with another tutorial on Layer Slayer. In this video, I'm going to talk about the active and knockout settings of the Slayer layers. The active and knockout settings help us build a more flexible system of layers that are aware of each other and can decide for themselves which one to show at what time. Now, just to summarize, those of you who saw my tutorial on the basic use of Layer Slayer saw how I added slayers in order to sync my content at different points in the layer stack. And that allowed me to build a whole group of layers that behaved as one as far as the content being shown in them. All I had to do was change something in my master, and the change would appear in every other Slayer layer. Now you may have noticed that I did very little in the way of trimming and adjusting the timing of my different slayers. All I did was decide at what point I wanted them to come in and what level in the layer stack I wanted it. Now normally when you pile up a bunch of similar layers, you would notice a buildup of the alpha channel. That didn't happen here, even though they clearly overlap in the timeline, and that's thanks to the active and knockout settings. Now, when you add a new Slayer layer, you'll notice that under its effects, there's a custom effect called Slayer Options, and that's where we're going to find the active setting and the knockout setting. Now, as I go forward explaining this, try to remember that these two settings, along with their equivalent settings in the other Slayer layers, engage in a somewhat interdependent cycle. So it might be hard to follow in a linear way what's happening. But I want to introduce you to how they work so that you can go and play around and figure it out and get a sense of how to use them to your advantage. Now, we call a layer active if it's being shown. So there are a number of things that will affect whether a layer is being shown. A couple of them are built into After Effects, like the eyeball switch, and of course the timing. If I'm at this time and my layer does not cover this time, it's not active. It's not being shown and it's not active. Now, aside from that, Layer Slayer has its own internal way of figuring out which of these slayers should be shown. Now, let's start by pointing out that the master layer is always knocked out by a slayer. And that's achieved via a special channel effect that is added to the master layer the first time you add a slayer. So that's right here. It's called LS knockout. And what it does is it looks up and down in the layer stack to see if there are active slayers at that point. So in my comp, the only point where there are none is right at the beginning. And you could see how this alpha setting goes to alpha. As soon as we hit a slayer, it goes to off. So the master is always knocked out or inactive when a slayer is active. If you need to, you can disable that behavior by disabling the effect itself. The way I have it now, the master will always be active, and you may or may not want that. Aside from knocking out the master, slayers knock each other out as well. The question is how? At this point, it's very simple. We have the master and one slayer. The master is knocked out while the slayer is active. If I set the slayer's active setting to off, notice how my master layer stops getting knocked out. I'll turn the slayer back on and go to a point where we have two slayers overlapping. Clearly what we want here is for the middle slayer to knock out the slayer at the back. The master is already taken care of, and the slayer at the back, if we look at the knockout settings, says knockout from above. So whenever there's a slayer above it, so whenever there is an active slayer above this layer too will be muted. Unlike the master, the muting here happens through the opacity. So if I cross over this point, you'll see that my opacity goes to 100, or in fact, whatever value I set it to. And when it goes into a part of the timeline where it should be knocked out, the opacity goes to 0. So this should give you a sense of how the layers interact with each other. If I told this layer, don't get knocked out by any slayer, then it will be on regardless. And I can keyframe the active state pretty much freely. So all this to say that between the active state and the knockout state, you have something of a system going on between these layers that decides which one to show. And that gives you an incredible amount of flexibility as far as how you want to build your projects and what your layer structure looks like. So I encourage you to build your own project and start playing with these options in your slayers to get a sense of how they work. Like I said, it's a bit of a system and it's very interrelated, so it'll take a little bit of tweaking and practicing to really understand what's going on. However, if you're not the type to experiment, you might just want to remember that by default, the master is always knocked out and slayers are knocked out by slayers above them. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned for more tutorials.